The Phoenicians are often thought to be a somewhat mysterious people. Long held to be a lost civilization due to the lack of Phoenician written sources, this ancient Semitic people, who dwelt on the Levantine shores of the Mediterranean Sea in the 2nd and 1st millennium BC, have only quite recently become better known to historians and the wider public. Usually noted for their thalassocratic state, that is, a state with a primarily maritime empire, the Phoenicians built an expansive and complex trading network that stretched the length of the Mediterranean Sea, not only facilitating exchange across the region, but becoming fantastically wealthy in the process. However, there is far more to the Phoenicians than their mercantile ability. Phoenician craftsmen produced outstanding works, including exemplary glass products and the prestigious dye known as Tyrian purple, worn by elites throughout the ancient world. Their trade empire arguably laid the foundations for the classical exchange across the Mediterranean and Near East, which would form the basis of classical Western civilization, of the kind we most readily associate with ancient Greece and Rome. Perhaps most impressive of all is the Phoenician alphabet, the oldest known consonantal alphabet in the world. It is from this alphabet that some of the most widely used alphabets in the world derive. The Latin, Cyrillic, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic alphabets appear to all owe their existence to the Phoenicians, as their incredibly convenient and easily adapted alphabet was spread around the Mediterranean through their trading empire. There is so much more to the Phoenicians than you might think, despite the relative lack of sources. Their influence was enormous, their rise to power rapid and impressive, and the echoes of Phoenician civilization can even be spied today. Hopefully you get some sense of this in today's video, as we try to answer the question, who were the Phoenicians? The Phoenicians were Canaanites, the name given to a collection of Semitic-speaking civilizations clustered on the Mediterranean shores of the southern Levant during the 2nd millennium BC. Of course, the word Canaan is used frequently in the Bible to denote the Promised Land. In ethnic terms, it is a catch-all to refer to the various peoples, both sedentary and semi-nomadic, who inhabited the southern Levant in this period. The Phoenicians were most likely the successors of the Bronze Age Canaanites, who dwelt in what is now southern Lebanon. However, some historians believe that the Phoenicians may have emigrated to their lands in the Levant. Herodotus, writing in the 4th century BC, asserted that the Phoenicians originated from the region of the Erythraean Sea in the early 3rd millennium BC. These, they say, came from that which is called the Erythraean Sea, to this sea of ours, and having settled in the land where they continue even now to dwell, set themselves forthwith to make long voyages by sea. Strabo, the Greek geographer writing in the 1st century BC, echoed Herodotus's view. It is from this place that the Phoenicians moved, to establish themselves on the shores of the Mediterranean. The Dilmun civilization did flourish in what is now Bahrain from the late 3rd millennium to the 2nd millennium BC, and this culture has been advanced as a potential progenitor of the Phoenicians. However, it has also been pointed out that the dates do not align particularly well, and that during the early 3rd millennium, when the Phoenicians supposedly migrated, there is no evidence for occupation of Bahrain. Genetic analysis is not exactly conclusive either. A 2017 study found that modern-day Lebanese populations derive the majority of their ancestry from Canaanite populations, implying a high degree of genetic continuity and suggesting that the Phoenicians were the native inhabitants of the Levant. However, a 2021 study found significant similarities between the genetic history of ancient Levantines and the modern inhabitants of Arabia. That said, most scholars tend to the view that the Phoenicians were the result of millennia of population continuity in the Levant. Phoenician culture most likely developed from the Gasulian culture, a people typified by small settlements of agricultural peoples who had migrated into the southern Levant from further north. This Gasulian culture existed during the Chalcolithic period from the mid-5th to the mid-4th millennium BC and preceded the Bronze Age. Many theories regarding the ethnogenesis of the Phoenicians have been advanced, including that they were formed from a merging of non-Semitic inhabitants with Semitic peoples migrating from further east. However, it is near impossible to make assertions with any degree of certainty on this matter. It is during the 15th century BC that the Phoenicians first truly enter the historical record. During the reign of the conquering pharaoh Thutmose III, the Phoenician cities of the Levant were brought under Egyptian control, along with all of Syria. Phoenician territory provided the Egyptians with two things: trade links into the interior of the Middle East to facilitate exchange with Mesopotamia, and a ready supply of timber. The cedar and fir forests which teemed along the Phoenician coast were almost totally lacking in Egypt itself. At this point, the Phoenician cities, the most important of which were Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, and Byblos, came under Egyptian rule. However, the pharaohs appear to have ruled their Phoenician subjects with a relatively light touch. The Phoenician cities were essentially autonomous, with their own political organizations and trade enterprises. They were also apparently in competition with one another, particularly in a commercial sense. The Amarna letters, a series of cuneiform tablet letters exchanged between Egypt and Phoenicia, point to this. For example, in letter 105, King of Byblos, Rib-Hadar, complains to Pharaoh Akhenaten that two of his trading vessels had been confiscated by the ruler of Beirut. Despite this fierce competition, the Phoenician cities all profited from Egyptian overlordship, which facilitated a thriving internal market of goods. Phoenician ships brought products from abroad, and the demand for Phoenician cedar was constant. Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, Byblos, Arwad, and the other Phoenician cities, such as Baalbek, Sarepta, and Sumur, flourished and grew wealthy. It is worth taking a moment to point out the importance of Phoenician shipbuilding. By 1200 BC, the Phoenicians had developed sophisticated shipbuilding techniques, capable of producing large merchant vessels. Keeled ships with extremely robust mortise and tenon joints, a technique which remained a standard until the later Roman period. They also made use of brailed sails. Brails are lines used to shape and furl a ship's sails, crucial for tacking against the wind, thereby increasing speed and efficiency. It was this Phoenician naval prowess which would facilitate their rise to become the preeminent mercantile power of the ancient Mediterranean. Then came the period of social and political upheaval known as the Late Bronze Age collapse, a period in which the palace economies of Mycenaean Greece and the powerful Hittite Empire collapsed entirely. The exact reason for this widespread instability is hotly debated, although environmental factors such as drought, pestilence, and volcanic eruptions, as well as mass migrations of groups such as the Dorian Greeks and Sea Peoples, are among the most popular theories. In fact, this period of societal upheaval likely sowed the seeds for the rise of the Phoenicians across the Mediterranean. In the febrile atmosphere of the 12th and 11th centuries BC, with the traditional power of great empires like Egypt and Assyria severely weakened, and the once mighty Greek and Anatolian palace cultures having disintegrated into polities of isolated small villages, the Phoenicians found themselves with vastly increased autonomy and the opportunity to project their power westwards. Whether through luck or through canny payments to invading peoples, the Phoenicians appear to have emerged largely unscathed from the chaos of the 12th century BC Late Bronze Age collapse. Filling the power vacuum created by the Late Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians used their considerable maritime ability to create a fantastically prosperous trading empire, founding ports, warehouses, and markets along the shores of the Mediterranean. We will return to Phoenician trade in more detail later, but suffice it to say for now that the Phoenicians dominated Mediterranean trade for centuries between 1200 and 800 BC. Byblos and Sidon appear to have been the greatest cities initially, although the fortunes of all the Phoenician cities rose and fell over the centuries. Indeed, it was the city of Tyre which led the way when it came to the establishment of Phoenician colonies throughout the Mediterranean. Founded in order to facilitate the expansion of Phoenician trading operations, colonies were typically quite small settlements, rarely of more than 1,000 inhabitants. As such, the Phoenician colonies usually did not expand their territorial control far beyond the city limits. A notable exception is of course Carthage, founded by settlers from Tyre in 814 BC, which grew to be a major metropolis, and even created its own empire through the establishment of a hegemony over other Phoenician colonies in the western Mediterranean. Colonies, once established by a mother city, were essentially autonomous, responsible for their own administration and affairs, although a tribute payment was typically sent back to the mother city at regular intervals. The earliest Phoenician colonies were founded on the islands of Cyprus and Crete, with a slow westward expansion into Sicily, Corsica, Sardinia, and the Balearic Islands, and along the coasts of northwestern Africa. There were even some settlements established on the Iberian Peninsula and beyond the Straits of Gibraltar on the Atlantic seaboard. Colonization was conducted in competition with Greek cities, who were also busy establishing settlements, although actual armed conflict between Greek and Phoenician cities was rather rare. Although a collection of independent and often competing cities, the Phoenicians as a collective represented a powerful political entity during the Iron Age. Having thrown off Egyptian hegemony, they were able to create trade arrangements on their own terms. Their rise to power was also remarkably peaceful. It appears that none of the Phoenician cities seriously attempted to subject the other city-states to their rule through military means, and in doing so create a unitary Phoenician state. This may also be somewhat down to the fact that as a thalassocracy, a maritime empire, with cities clustered in coastal regions, the Phoenicians quite simply lacked the manpower to support a large military. It was this relative martial weakness that proved to be the ultimate undoing of the Phoenician city-states, as we shall see later in this video. However, for now, we shall turn to an analysis of the society and culture of this Levantine people. Politically and culturally, the Phoenicians were organized around the institution of the city-state, autonomous urban centers, which typically exercised control over their immediate territorial surroundings. Phoenician city-states were also monarchical, especially in the 2nd millennium BC. In these early stages of Phoenician civilization, monarchs wielded near limitless power over the commercial, political, and religious affairs of the city. As the centuries progressed, the Phoenician city-states appear to have developed democratic institutions, such as councils of elders and assemblies of the people. This has led to the conclusion that the Phoenician city-states were proto-democratic in nature. This combination of monarchy with democratic elements is strikingly similar to the system of governance in ancient Sparta, leading some historians to assert that the Spartans were following a Phoenician prototype. These democratic elements gradually increased in power and influence during the 1st millennium BC. In the 6th century BC, the city of Tyre appears to have been ruled by a pair of judges known as suffets, according to the historian Flavius Josephus, similar in style to the Roman system of dual consuls. And when Alexander the Great reached Tyre in 333 BC, he was met by a council which represented the commonwealth of the city. Similarly, when Alexander reached Sidon, the city's king, Strato, surrendered to Alexander at the urging of the people, according to the Roman historian Quintus Curtius Rufus. He had surrendered rather at the desire of the people than of his own accord. The structure of Phoenician society below the office of monarch is a little difficult to construct due to a paucity of sources. Even with the development of councils and assemblies, oligarchic elites certainly would have existed, particularly in relation to the trading activities of the Phoenician cities. The book of Isaiah mentions the merchant princes of Phoenicia, powerful merchant families who would have exercised considerable control thanks to their great wealth. Assemblies initially took the form of councils of elders or prominent citizens, members of the royal family, and powerful merchants who would aid Phoenician monarchs with advice or guidance, particularly in times of crisis. No doubt the monarchs of the Phoenician city-states would have had an array of government officials at their disposal. The scale and complexity of trading operations alone would have surely necessitated this. A well-developed and sophisticated legal system must have also existed in order to facilitate the expansive Phoenician trading empire. Aristotle, writing in the 4th century BC, pointed out the importance of wealth in Phoenician, or specifically Carthaginian society. The Carthaginian polity is highly praised, and not without reason. It may be compared with the Spartan. It is an oligarchy with some democratic features. It lays stress upon wealth. In Carthage, all offices are bought and sold. Also, one may hold several offices together. These are bad features, but the discontent of the people is soothed by schemes of emigration. The priesthood itself, as with many other ancient Mediterranean civilizations, was another important class in Phoenician society. Phoenician monarchs often personally held a religious function, sometimes acting as a symbolic high priest. This intertwining of royalty and priesthood went even further, and it is likely that many Phoenician priests would have been members of the royal family, or perhaps belonged to prominent mercantile families. The inscriptions on the coffin of Queen Batnoum of Byblos indicate that her husband was the priest Paltibal. Batnoum, mother of King Osbal, king of Byblos, son of Paltibal, priest of the mistress. The Phoenician economy was centered on one all-important element: trade. The trade networks of the Phoenicians stretched across the entire Mediterranean. It is hard to overstate the importance of these trade routes in facilitating the cultural and economic exchange which would later form the basis of Greek and Roman interactions with the Mediterranean world. In fact, anthropologist Ralph Linton noted that their main role in the development of Greek and other Mediterranean cultures was as intermediaries between Asia and Europe. The expansive Phoenician trade network, reaching across the entire Mediterranean basin, facilitated the exchange of goods and culture between the diverse peoples who dwelt on its shores. Near Eastern goods reached Greece and Italy via the traders of Phoenicia, and it was the boats of these traders which brought commodities from the Atlantic seaboard of Europe into the heart of the Mediterranean. In acting as middlemen, Phoenician traders were able to utilize their expansive trade networks to turn great profits on a variety of goods. For example, tin, common in Britain, Brittany, and Galicia, was far rarer in the Mediterranean, and therefore far more valuable. Indeed, Strabo notes that the Phoenicians carried on a roaring trade in tin from the inhabitants of the Cassiterides, islands described as lying off the northwestern coast of the Iberian Peninsula. Described as separate from the British Isles, the Cassiterides have been identified as the coast of Cornwall, the Scilly Isles, and islands in the mouth of the River Loire. To what extent Phoenician traders operated according to what we might call free market principles, with prices fluctuating according to supply and demand, is debated. State officials and noble families, as well as consortiums of traders, would have all engaged in trade operations, and most actual exchange would have likely been conducted in markets overseen by the government of the local Phoenician city-state. As with controlled trade in much of the ancient world, prices were often fixed. The Phoenicians established emporia, warehouses, and ports across the Mediterranean, founding colonies in strategic locations to further facilitate trade and economic extraction. Phoenician traders did not simply act as hauliers of goods either. They also engaged in exporting domestic products. The only real commodity found in Phoenicia was cedar, forests of which adorned the hills of the Levant that tumble down to the shores of the Mediterranean. With its great height and width, cedar is an excellent wood for shipbuilding, and it was for this purpose that much of Phoenicia's cedar was exported, up the Euphrates River to Mesopotamia and down the Mediterranean coast, southwards to Egypt. Neither region had a readily accessible source of timber. It was not simply for the construction of ships that Phoenician cedar was used either, as it found use as a building material too. King Hiram of Tyre provided the biblical King Solomon with cedar and fir for the construction of his temple in Jerusalem, according to the first book of Kings, and the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the ancient wonders of the world, possessed a roof made of cedar, although whether this specifically came from a Phoenician source is unclear. The Roman architect Vitruvius simply notes that the region was a source of cedar wood. Aside from trade and the export of wood in large quantities, the economy of the Phoenician cities was largely made up of a variety of industries. The art of glassmaking, learned from the Egyptians, was further developed by the Phoenicians, who created transparent and opaque glass. Tyre, Sidon, and Sarepta became especially important centers of production, churning out vast numbers of plates, drinking glasses, vases, beads, and jewellery, much of it elaborately patterned, which was then exported and sold across the Mediterranean. The Phoenicians were also particularly famed for their textiles too. Linen from Egypt and silk from Persia, woven into fine garments and exported. Homer, who was rather disparaging of the greed of the Phoenicians in his Iliad, does point out that Paris gifted Helen precious fabrics created by the women of Sidon. However, the most famous Phoenician textile has to be Tyrian or Sidonian purple, a striking purple dye ranging in hue from deepest purple to bright pink, which the Phoenicians sold as a luxury product. Obtained from the hypobranchial gland of murex sea snails, the dye's laborious extraction process and the total Phoenician monopoly over the product made it extremely expensive and very desirable, particularly as a status symbol among high-ranking nobles of various Mediterranean civilizations. Perhaps the greatest lasting influence that the Phoenicians have had on the world is their alphabet. Many of the writing systems in use across the world today can trace their origins to the Phoenician system. The Latin, Cyrillic, Georgian, and Armenian scripts, for example, are all derived from the Greek alphabet, which in turn has its origins in the Phoenician alphabet. The Arabic and Hebrew scripts, both originating in the Aramaic alphabet, in turn owe their existence to the Phoenician script. The earliest Aramaic inscriptions use the Phoenician alphabet. No doubt Phoenicia's wide-reaching influence across the Mediterranean, largely thanks to its colonies and merchants, was responsible for the dissemination of the Phoenician alphabet and its subsequent adaptations. The Phoenician alphabet itself is what is known as an abjad, or a consonantal alphabet. That is, the alphabet consists only of consonants, with vowels being inferred by the reader. It is also notable that it was the first alphabet to have a set writing direction, from right to left. Let's take a look at the 22 letters of the Phoenician alphabet. Their relatively angular form is clear to see, making them easy to inscribe with a stylus, which would have been the primary method of writing. The alphabet is a direct development of the Proto-Canaanite script, itself a derivation of Egyptian hieroglyphs. If we place the Phoenician alphabet side by side with hieroglyphs, we can trace the similarities between the two. The Phoenician letters are mostly a simplification of their hieroglyphic equivalent. The simplicity of their Phoenician alphabet was its great strength. Its phonetic nature allowed it to easily adapt to a multitude of languages, and the relatively small number of letters meant it was easy to learn, leading to its quick uptake across the Mediterranean as a useful tool to facilitate trade and commerce. Contrast this to the highly complex and technical cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphs, which likely required extensive training to achieve proficiency, restricting these scripts to a highly educated literary elite. Details of the Phoenician language itself are slightly less well known. It is agreed that Phoenician was a Canaanite Semitic language and developed in the Levant around the primary cities of Tyre and Sidon. As noted by its designation as a Canaanite language, Phoenician was very similar to Hebrew, at least in the early stages of its development. At a more detailed level, the Phoenician language was comprised of a number of dialects. The Biblian and Tyro-Sidonian dialects have been identified as primary examples of these. However, whether Phoenician was a distinct language of its own, or simply an artificially defined collection of dialects, which made up part of a wider collection of Near Eastern languages, is hard to say with certainty. Whatever the case, Phoenician dialects were spoken up until around the 2nd century BC, and Phoenician maritime activity spread the language around the Mediterranean. The Western Mediterranean Punic language, an offshoot of Phoenician spoken in Carthage, survived until much later, perhaps the 6th century AD. Phoenician religion, like many other aspects of Phoenician culture, was subject to a great deal of localized variation. Each city-state had its own pantheon of gods, which formed the basis of each city's specific religious identity. That said, there were many broad common features which allows us to conclude that there was a Phoenician religion shared by these city-states and their inhabitants. Just as the seafaring Phoenicians display the influences of neighbouring civilizations on their artistic and cultural production, so too was their religion shaped by Greek, Egyptian, and Mesopotamian faiths. Details of Phoenician religion are unfortunately hard to come by, due to a scarcity of written sources. No Phoenician religious text, if there ever was one, has survived. Instead, we must rely on the works of later authors in order to build a picture of Phoenician worship. Written in the 2nd century AD, Philo of Byblos's Phoenicae Historia attests to the polytheistic nature of the Phoenician religion, asserting that the gods were divine forces responsible for the creation and shaping of the physical world. The gods and their relationship to humanity, primarily expressed through the institution of the cult, therefore appear to have formed the basis of Phoenician religion. Offerings to the gods would appease and satiate them. Negligence in one's duty to the gods could incur their wrath. Ritual sacrifice of animals, oil, wine, flowers, incense, and votive statues was the method by which the Phoenicians interacted with their gods and reflected the structure of their relationship with the divine. Although from later Carthage, an inscribed stele found in Marseille describes detailed conventions and stipulations for ritual sacrifice, including fees to be paid, the actors involved in the ritual itself, and even the method for dividing any sacrificial meat. The possibility that the Phoenicians practiced human sacrifice is hotly debated, primarily hinging on the attestation of Greek and Roman sources concerning the city of Carthage. It is unclear whether the ashes of infants found in Punic urns in North Africa, Sardinia, and Sicily were actual human sacrifices, or whether these children perished of natural causes and had their remains offered to the gods in a symbolic sense, likely with the intention of requesting new offspring. Interestingly, the Bible gives us a clue as to the existence of a priestly class amongst the Phoenicians. The first book of Kings contains reference to the 450 prophets of Baal and their confrontation with the prophet Elijah. In attempting to invoke Baal, the prophets engage in frenzied movement, dancing, singing, and jumping about. Predictably, the attempt is futile, and the prophets are unable to move their god to action, in stark contrast to Elijah. However, the tale does suggest a large and active priestly class. As in more familiar Greek mythology, the gods were ascribed human traits and emotions, but their divinity and otherness was never denied. Each Phoenician city would have had its own chief deity and accompanying pantheon. Many of these deities were common throughout Phoenician territory. Melkart, chief god of Tyre, represented monarchy, the sea, hunting, and colonization. Indeed, it was the expansion of Tyrian trade and colonization throughout the Mediterranean that led to Melkart's association with the cities of Carthage and Cadiz, both of which were colonies of Tyre. Balat or Balat Gabal was the protector goddess of the city of Byblos, associated with the earth and fertility. Balat has been equated with the Egyptian god Isis. In the city of Sidon, Baal appears to have reigned supreme, head of the pantheon, but apparently somewhat detached from everyday worship. Instead, the fertility goddess Astarte is far more prominent, appearing in Phoenician inscriptions and statues. Of course, aside from these prominent deities of the great Phoenician cities, there was a plethora of gods and goddesses. El, most ancient of the gods, was described by Philo of Byblos as possessing 4 eyes and 4 wings, and is readily compared with the Greek father of the gods, Kronos. The god Resheph commanded storms and was responsible for fire and lightning. Dagon, held to be inventor of the plough, was god of wheat. It is worth noting the multi-perspectiveness of divinity in Phoenician polytheism. Gods and goddesses often united several attributes in one figure, and these attributes and associations varied throughout Phoenician territory. For example, Astarte, protector of the dynasty, goddess of the sea, and simultaneously the divinity responsible for sexuality and fertility. At Byblos, she is closely associated with Baal, at Tyre, Melkart, and at Sidon, the healer god Eshmun. The commercial hubs spread across the shores of the Mediterranean played host to a vast array of diverse peoples: Greeks, Phoenicians, Egyptians, Syrians, Anatolians, each bringing their own gods. It is easy to see how such an atmosphere could lead to hybrid practices and the fluid interplay of different divinities and rituals. Phoenician art appears to have been something of an amalgamation of many different cultural styles, reflecting the influences of neighbouring peoples and of the seafaring nature of the Phoenician city-states. Aegean, Northern Syrian, Cypriot, Assyrian and Egyptian styles can all be found in Phoenician artistic works, which included wood and metalwork, ivory carvings and textiles. The highly prized purple dye obtained from murex sea snails was the apex of Phoenician textile production. Small-scale ornamental pieces appear to make up the majority of Phoenician artistic production. While larger sculptures do survive, they are rare. Carved monuments or stelae are more common. An example from Amrit, dating from the 6th to the 9th centuries BC, displays the influence of neighbouring cultures on Phoenician art, with a figure wearing Egyptian headgear and the inclusion of the classic Assyrian motif of a lion standing atop a mountain. The incredibly ornate stone sarcophagus of King Ahiram of Byblos is an even older example of Phoenician artistry, dating from the 12th to 13th centuries BC. Bronze figures survive in much larger numbers, sometimes coated in gold leaf and often depicted wearing distinctive conical hats. Ivory sculptures, most often rectangular and carved in high relief, display Egyptian and Assyrian influences. Lions, sphinxes, and winged goddesses. Metal bowls have been discovered in large numbers too. Often highly decorative in nature, these bowls display the usual Phoenician mix of cultural influences, with geometric and floral designs, human figures, goddesses, sphinxes, and animals. The Phoenicians continued the Egyptian tradition of glassmaking, most often producing opaque glass amphora with striped patterns of blue and yellow. Phoenician craftsmen and women were apparently highly prized by neighbouring peoples too. Many historical sources attest to the quality of Phoenician artistry. The First Book of Kings and the Second Book of Chronicles describe the involvement of Phoenician artisans in the construction of the Temple of Solomon. A master craftsman named Hiram reportedly oversaw the project, while it was stonemasons from Byblos who cut the stones to erect the temple. The Phoenician king of Tyre described Hiram thus: "I am sending you Huram-Abi, a man of great skill. He is trained to work in gold and silver, bronze and iron, stone and wood, and with purple and blue and crimson yarn and fine linen. He is experienced in all kinds of engraving and can execute any design given to him." Homer's epic, the Iliad, mentions the artistic works of the Phoenician city of Sidon twice. At the funeral games of Patroclus, the prize offered for one of the running races is a silver bowl of Sidonian make. Then the son of Peleus straightway set forth other prizes for fleetness of foot: a mixing bowl of silver, richly wrought, 6 measures it held, and in beauty it was far the goodliest in all the earth, seeing that Sidonians, well skilled in deft handiwork, had wrought it cunningly. In the political vacuum of the centuries that followed the Late Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenicians were able to operate their trade empire with impunity, unhindered by large, powerful inland empires. However, as the first millennium BC progressed, large powers began to once again politically dominate the Near East and the Mediterranean, threatening and eventually altogether curtailing Phoenician independence. Assyrian king Shalmaneser III of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, ruling from 859 to 824 BC, spent much of his reign conducting campaigns against various peoples. Under Shalmaneser, the Phoenician cities were forced into vassalage, retaining a degree of freedom whilst being forced to pay heavy tributes. This situation continued for over a century after the death of Shalmaneser, ending in the reign of Tiglath-Pileser III. The new king instead desired total control over Phoenicia and annexed all of the Phoenician cities by 738 BC, save only the most powerful city-states of Byblos and Tyre. Both cities, along with Sidon, rebelled against their Assyrian overlords, but these rebellions were rapidly quashed. Sidon itself was totally destroyed in the early 7th century BC, before being built anew. With the collapse of the Neo-Assyrian Empire at the close of the 7th century BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire filled the resulting vacuum. Political instability continued to rack the Phoenician cities as a series of rebellions against Babylonian rule occurred, including a 13-year siege of Tyre during the reign of Nebuchadnezzar II. When Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Achaemenid Empire, took Babylon in 539 BC, The Phoenician cities apparently made the expedient decision to willingly submit to the new emperor. This decision turned out to be a wise one, as the tribute exacted from the satrapy of Phoenicia was considerably lighter than that of other provinces, once again pointing to the continued economic importance of the Phoenician cities. The city-states, whilst no longer independent, were evidently permitted to continue their considerable mercantile operations unhindered. It also attests to the importance of Phoenician shipbuilding for the Persian Empire. Herodotus considered them to be the best sailors amongst the Persian forces, and notes how it was the Phoenician cities who provided the vast majority of the ships required to transport the enormous Persian armies involved in the Greco-Persian wars. In fact, Herodotus refers to the fleets of the invading Persian forces as simply the Phoenicians. Despite being apparently willing participants in the Persian imperial project, it seemed that large numbers of Phoenicians emigrated westwards, into regions where the yoke of Persian imperialism did not reach. In particular to Carthage, which was emerging as a powerful and independent trading empire. Phoenicia entered the Hellenistic period when it was conquered by Alexander the Great. By the 330s, Tyre was the principal Phoenician city in the Levant and the primary target for Alexander's army in the region. The city was subjected to a 7-month siege in 332 BC. The city of Tyre was actually built on an island just off the coast. Alexander's forces spent much of the siege building an artificial causeway out to the island, which allowed them to assault the city walls. During the course of the siege, many of the city's citizens fled to Carthage. After Tyre fell, thousands of its citizens perished in a violent sack, and a reported 2,000 more were crucified by Alexander's men. The remainder of the Phoenician cities fell into line with remarkable speed. Although Hellenization occurred in Phoenicia to some extent during the reign of Alexander and the subsequent reign of the Seleucid emperors, the Phoenician cities were largely able to retain their trading fleets and keep their traditions alive. However, as Seleucid power declined, so too did the fortunes of the Phoenicians. Caught between warring empires, the Phoenicians had long ago lost their true political power. The annexation of the region by the Roman Republic under the general Pompey, and the absorption of the once great Phoenician city-states into the province of Syria, formally ended a decline which had begun centuries earlier. Of course, the Tyrian foundation of Carthage met a much more violent end at the hands of the Republic, totally destroyed in 146 BC at the culmination of the decades-long Punic Wars.